Are you prepared to trust me completely? My stepfather, William, asked, his voice low and steady. I froze at the weight of his question, pulled into a silence I couldn't explain. His eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made my chest tighten. Trust him fully, he said. I wasn't sure how to answer, but I couldn't look away. William wasn't just anyone. He had been a rock in my life when Mom was too caught up in her career. He was kind, patient, and always seemed to know what I needed before I even said it. But lately, something had shifted. The way he looked at me lingered longer. His compliments weren't just casual, they carried a weight that left me feeling exposed. It all started on a Saturday evening when my mom left for an overnight trip to visit her old college friend. I thought it would be just another quiet evening at home, but William had other plans. He knocked on my door in an unusually inviting tone. "Dinner's ready," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I walked into the kitchen to find the table set for two. Candles flickered softly, casting shadows across the room. It wasn't romantic, at least, that's what I told myself, but it was different. As we sat down, he poured me a glass of sparkling water and raised his own. "To trust," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "To trust," I echoed, though my voice trembled slightly. The conversation started innocently enough, school, future plans, the usual, but then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You know, Emily," he began, his voice dropping an octave, "trust is the foundation of everything. I think it's time you learn to trust people more, including me." His words felt loaded, but I nodded, unsure of what else to do. He smiled, the kind of smile that made me both nervous and curious. As the evening went on, he suggested we do something together the next day. "How about I teach you how to drive?" he offered, his tone light but his eyes piercing. I hesitated. Learning to drive was something I'd wanted for a while, but the idea of spending hours alone with him felt complicated. Still, I found myself agreeing. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying our conversation. There was something in his voice, in the way he spoke to me, that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't threatening, but it wasn't innocent either. It was a puzzle, and I couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring. The sun was barely up when William knocked on my door the next morning. "You ready?" he asked, leaning against the frame with that same easy confidence. I nodded, throwing on my jacket and grabbing my bag. The air outside was crisp, and the drive to the edge of town was quiet, save for the soft hum of the radio. My thoughts churned, stuck somewhere between excitement and unease. The parking lot by the lake was empty, save for a couple of stray ducks waddling across the gravel. William parked the car and motioned for me to switch seats. "Seat's okay," he said, sliding into the passenger side. "Let's start simple." The first hour was uneventful, adjusting mirrors, figuring out the pedals. William's instructions were calm and patient, but his proximity made my hand sweat on the wheel. He leaned in to point out the gears, his voice a low murmur in my ear. "Don't grip so tight," he said, placing his hand lightly over mine. The warmth of his skin sent a jolt up my arm, and I quickly pulled my hand back. "Sorry," I muttered, avoiding his gaze. "Relax," he said, leaning back in his seat, his lips curling into a faint smile. "You're doing fine." We drove in slow circles around the lot before he directed me toward a small incline at the edge of the property. "Stop here," he said. "Let's practice starting on a hill." I pressed the brakes, feeling the car tilt slightly. "Okay, now ease off the clutch and give it a little gas," William instructed. My foot hesitated on the pedal, and the car jolted forward before stalling. "Here," he said, leaning over to grab the gearshift. His arm brushed against mine, and the faint scent of his cologne filled the space between us. "Let me show you," he murmured, his fingers wrapping around mine, guiding my hand back to the wheel. The world outside seemed to blur as I focused on the closeness of his presence. My pulse quickened, and I prayed he couldn't hear it. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. I nodded, though my throat felt dry. "Yeah, I'm fine." The rest of the lesson passed in a haze. By the time we drove back toward town, my thoughts were spinning. William, however, seemed completely at ease, casually chatting about the best coffee spots in the area. "You've earned a break," he said, pulling into the lot of a small cafe I'd never been to. Inside, the space was warm and cozy, with mismatched chairs and the scent of fresh pastries wafting through the air. We sat at a corner table, and for the first time, I felt his gaze linger on me, not in the way a parent looks at their child, but something different, something I couldn't name. You're a quick learner, he said, his voice steady but his eyes studying me intently. You remind me of your mom when she was younger, determined, but a little unsure of herself. I shifted in my seat, unsure how to respond. Thanks, I guess, I mumbled. He smiled, his expression softening. It's a good thing, Emily, you just need someone to help you see it. The way he said it made my stomach twist, and I looked away, pretending to focus on the menu. So, what's good here? I asked, desperate to change the subject. He chuckled lightly, as if amused by my attempts to redirect the conversation about the croissant and the coffee strong enough to wake the dead. We ordered, and as we ate, I felt myself relaxing. William had a way of making even the most mundane moments feel significant. But just as I began to let my guard down, his next words pulled me back into that uncertain space. You know, trust isn't something that comes naturally to everyone, he said, leaning back in his chair. It takes time and the right person. I blinked, unsure if he meant more than he was saying. I guess, I replied, my voice quieter now. His eyes met mine, holding my gaze for a beat too long. It's something to think about, he added. The ride home was quieter, the air between us charged with something unspoken. When we pulled into the driveway, he placed a hand on my shoulder, stopping me before I could get out. You did good today, he said, his thumb brushing against the fabric of my jacket. I'm proud of you. Thanks, I said, my voice fairly audible. That night, I replayed the day in my head, dissecting every glance, every word. Something was shifting, and I didn't know if I should feel excited or terrified, but deep down, I knew this was only the beginning, and what came next, I wasn't sure I was ready for. When I walked into the house that evening, the familiar smell of roasted garlic and herbs filled the air. It was earlier than usual. My training had been cut short due to a power outage at the gym. The house was quiet, save for the faint clink of a glass in the kitchen. I rounded the corner to find William standing by the counter, a half-full wine glass in his hand. Rough day, he asked, his voice casual but warm. He looked relaxed, his tie loosened and the top button of his shirt undone. Something like that, I lied, setting my bag down. He gestured toward the open bottle on the counter. Want a glass? I hesitated for a moment before nodding. Sure, why not? He poured the wine and handed me a glass, the edge of his fingers brushing mine. It was such a small, insignificant touch, but it lingered in my mind longer than it should have. I perched on one of the bar stools, and William leaned against the counter across from me, his gaze steady. So, what happened at training? He asked, spinning the wine in his glass. Power went out, I said with a shrug. Nothing exciting. He chuckled. Sometimes the universe gives us a break, huh? We fell into an easy conversation that started with small talk, weather, work, the latest Netflix shows, but soon drifted into deeper territory. William shared stories I'd never heard before, how he met my mom at a charity gala, the challenges of blending two families, and the sacrifices he'd made to ensure we felt stable. I always wanted to make sure you had what you needed, he said, his voice soft but unwavering, even if it meant putting my own dreams on hold. His honesty caught me off guard. William rarely talked about himself, let alone his vulnerabilities. You know, Emily, he said after a pause, his gaze locking onto mine, you're special. There's something about you, your determination, your resilience, that's rare. I felt my cheeks flush under his intense gaze. Thanks, I murmured, taking a sip of wine to hide my nervousness. No, I mean it, he pressed. You have this light in you, it's captivating. His words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. I forced a smile, unsure if it was a compliment or something more. The tone in his voice made me question everything, and the way he looked at me, it wasn't the way a stepfather should look at his stepdaughter. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. I excused myself after finishing my wine, retreating to my room under the pretense of being tired, but I wasn't tired. My mind was racing, replaying every word, every glance. Later that night, as I made my way to the kitchen for a glass of water, I noticed light spilling into the hallway from William's office. The door was slightly ajar, and curiosity got the better of me. I peeked inside, intending only to see if he was still awake. What I saw stopped me cold. William was sitting at his desk, a photo in his hand. It was a picture of me taken a few years ago during a family vacation. I recognized the photo immediately. It had been my favorite at the time. In it, I was laughing carefreely, the sunlight catching my hair. But why was he looking at it now, and why did his expression seem almost wistful? I stepped back quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't notice me, lost in his thoughts. I hurried back to my room, closing the door softly behind me. What had I just seen? Was it innocent, or did it mean something more? My mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. The following day, I tried to act normal, but every interaction with William felt charged. When he asked if I wanted to join him for a jog later, I hesitated before agreeing, hoping physical activity might clear my head. The jog started uneventfully. We stopped at the park trails, making small talk as we ran. But as we reached a secluded clearing by the edge of the woods, William slowed to a stop. He bent over, hands on his knees, catching his breath. "You okay?" I asked, stopping beside him. "Yeah," he said, straightening up. "Just needed a breather." His gaze shifted to me, and for a moment, he looked like he wanted to say something. "What is it?" I prompted, feeling a pang of anxiety. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Nothing. Let's keep going." But it wasn't nothing. The weight in his voice, the way his expression hardened, left a pit in my stomach. That evening, after dinner, William suggested we watch a movie. Mom was still out, so it was just the two of us. I agreed, hoping it might ease the strange tension between us. He chose an old classic, something light and easy, but as we sat on the couch, the proximity between us felt too close. His arm rested along the back of the couch, just inches from my shoulder. Halfway through the movie, I excused myself to get a drink. My hands trembled as I poured a glass of water, and I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. When I returned, William had shifted his posture to a more relaxed one. He patted the seat beside him, and I hesitated before sitting down. "You seem tense," he said, his tone soft but probing. "Just tired," I lied. He reached out, his fingers brushing my shoulder. "If there's ever anything you need to talk about, you know you can trust me, right?" His touch lingered for a second too long. I nodded, forcing a weak smile. Of course. But the truth was, I didn't know if I could trust him anymore. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, something I wasn't ready for. The next day, Mom mentioned she'd be staying late at work for the rest of the week. My stomach churned at the thought of more one-on-one time with William. I told myself I was overthinking it, that I was being dramatic, but deep down, I knew better. And I couldn't shake the image of him in his office, holding that photo. What did it mean? What wasn't he telling me? Whatever it was, I had a feeling I was about to find out. The next morning, William's voice called out from the kitchen as I shuffled downstairs. "Emily, grab your swimsuit," he said cheerfully. "We're hitting the pool." I paused mid-step, caught off guard. "The pool?" I echoed. I stepped into the kitchen where he stood, sipping coffee. "Yeah," he said with a casual shrug. "Thought it'd be a good way to cool off, plus, you mentioned you wanted to improve your swimming." I hadn't, but the way he smiled, warm and unassuming, made it hard to argue. I nodded and headed back upstairs to grab my suit. The uneasy feeling in my chest hadn't left me since last night, but I pushed it aside. It was just swimming. What harm could it do? The water sparkled under the midday sun as William stood at the edge of the pool, arms crossed. "Let's start with the basics," he said, his voice carrying over the gentle splash of water. "Float on your back, I'll help." Sliding into the cool water, I tried to mimic his calm confidence, but my heart raced when he stepped in behind me. "Okay," he said, his hand settling lightly on my waist. "Relax, I've got you." The contact sent a shiver up my spine, and I fought to keep my breathing steady. "I don't think I'm good at this," I said, forcing a laugh. "You're overthinking it," he replied, his grip firm but gentle. "Just trust me." That word, trust, I closed my eyes and let my body drift. His hands studied me for a moment. Everything felt still, almost serene. Then his hands lingered, their presence impossible to ignore. "Good," he said softly, his voice close to my ear. "You're a natural." I pushed myself upright, water dripping down my face. "I think that's enough for now," I said quickly, swimming to the edge. His gaze followed me, but he didn't protest. "You did great," he said, pulling himself out of the pool. "We should do this more often." The rest of the afternoon passed uneventfully, but the tension between us was palpable. I avoided his eyes during lunch, my thoughts racing with questions. Was I imagining things, or was there something unspoken hanging between us? That evening, William knelt at my door. "Hey, can you help me with something?" he asked, holding up his laptop. "It's acting up again." I hesitated, then nodded, following him to his office. He sat at the desk while I pulled up a chair beside him. The screen flickered as I navigated through the settings, trying to focus on the task at hand. "Thanks for this," he said, his tone softer now. "You're really good at this kind of stuff." "No problem," I replied, not looking up as I typed. His hand brushed against mine, lingering just a fraction too long. I froze, my breath catching. "Sorry," he said, pulling his hand back, though his voice held a trace of something unspoken. "It's fine," I said quickly, but the air between us felt charged, the silence stretching uncomfortably. After a few more minutes, I finished troubleshooting. "That should do it," I said, pushing the laptop toward him. He smiled, his eyes locking onto mine. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Emily." I swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. His words felt loaded, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this moment meant more to him than it should. "Good night," I said abruptly, standing and heading for the door. But as I reached for the handle, his voice stopped me. "Emily," he said, his heart pounding. "Yeah? Thank you," he added, his expression unreadable. "For everything," I nodded, the weight of his gaze lingering long after I left the room. The following days were filled with more moments like these, small touches, lingering glances, words that seemed to carry double meanings. One evening, as I sat in the living room reading, William joined me, settling onto the couch. "What are you reading?" he asked, leaning closer to see the cover. I held it up. "Just a novel," I replied. He smiled, his arm draping casually over the back of the couch. "You're always so focused, it's impressive." "Thanks," I said, flipping a page, but I could feel his eyes on me. "You know," he began softly, "I don't think I've ever told you how much you mean to this family." "To me." My pulse quickened. "That's nice of you to say," I replied, keeping my eyes on the book. "It's the truth," he said, his tone serious. "You're remarkable, Emily. I hope you know that." I looked up, meeting his gaze. There was something in his eyes, something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. "Thanks," I said again, my voice barely above a whisper. The sound of Mom's car pulling into the driveway broke the moment, and I jumped to my feet. "I should go help her," I said quickly, rushing to the door. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The line between William's role as a stepfather and whatever was happening now felt increasingly blurred. I replayed every moment, every word, searching for clarity, but it eluded me. The next morning, William suggested we go for a hike. "It's good for clearing the mind," he said, his tone light. I agreed, hoping the fresh air might help me make sense of my swirling thoughts. We trekked through the woods, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. William walked ahead, pausing occasionally to point out a bird or a wildflower. "You're quiet today," he said, glancing back at me. "Just thinking," I replied. "About anything in particular?" he asked, his tone laced with curiosity. "Not really," I lied. We reached a clearing with a view of the valley below. William sat on a fallen log, motioning for me to join him. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, gesturing to the horizon. "Yeah," I said, though my gaze was fixed on the ground. After a moment, he spoke again. "You can talk to me, you know, about anything." I nodded, but didn't reply. The words felt heavy, almost like a challenge, as we made our way back to the house. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was building to something, the tension, the unspoken words, it was all leading somewhere. I just didn't know where. That night, the house was unnervingly quiet. Mom was away on another business trip, and it was just William and me. He had insisted on cooking dinner, and the smell of sautéed garlic and rosemary filled the kitchen. I sat at the counter, watching him move effortlessly around the space. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms that somehow seemed stronger than I'd ever noticed. "Can you hand me the knife?" he asked, breaking my train of thought. I nodded, reaching for it, but as I extended it to him, his hand brushed mine for a moment. He didn't move his fingers, just lingered over mine, and my breath caught. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Yeah, I managed," I replied, though my voice trembled. His eyes locked on mine, and for a second, the world outside the kitchen disappeared. Dinner was quiet, too quiet. The usual small talk felt forced, and the air between us buzzed with something I couldn't name. After we finished eating, William poured 2 glasses of wine. "Let's sit," he said, gesturing toward the couch in the living room. I followed, clutching my glass as if it were an anchor. The soft glow of the fireplace flickered, casting long shadows across the room. William sat beside me, closer than usual, his knee brushing against mine. I feel like you've been distant lately, he said, his tone measured. Is everything okay? I hesitated. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He leaned in slightly, his gaze steady. You can talk to me, Emily, about anything. The way he said my name sent a shiver down my spine. I nodded, looking away, but his hand gently touched my arm, drawing my attention back to him. You don't have to be scared, he said, his voice low and calming. You know I'd never let anything happen to you. Something in his words broke down the last of my defenses. It's just everything feels different lately, I said, my voice shaking. He didn't answer right away. Instead, his hand slid down my arm, its touch both reassuring and electric. Yet different isn't always bad, he whispered. The silence that followed felt heavy, charged. His hand lingered on mine, his thumb tracing slow circles against my skin. My heart raced, and I couldn't bring myself to pull away. Do you trust me? He finally asked, his voice fairly audible. I looked up at him, unable to find the words. His eyes were intense, searching mine for an answer. I didn't know how to give one. Slowly, deliberately, his other hand reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. My breath hitched, and time seemed to stand still. I need you to tell me if this is okay, he said, his voice trembling slightly. I nodded, barely aware of what I was agreeing to. His hand moved to my shoulder, sliding down to rest lightly on my back. Every nerve in my body felt like it was on fire, but I couldn't stop him, I didn't want to. The moments that followed blurred together, touches that lingered too long, breaths that came too fast. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, and suddenly there was no space left between us. And then it happened. When it was over, I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The silence between us was deafening, but neither of us moved. I could feel William's eyes on me, but I couldn't bring myself to meet his gaze. I'm sorry, he said finally, his voice breaking the quiet. I didn't mean for. Don't, I interrupted softly, my voice barely a whisper. Just don't. We didn't speak again that night. I slipped away to my room, locking the door behind me as I sank onto the bed, my mind replaying everything over and over, each moment sharper and more confusing than the last. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Mom's car pulling into the driveway. Panic surged through me as I hurried downstairs, trying to appear normal. William was in the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee as if nothing had happened. Mom walked in, her usual bright smile faltering slightly as her eyes shifted between us. Everything okay? She asked, her tone light but probing. Yeah, I said quickly, too quickly. Why wouldn't it be? She asked, but her eyes lingered on William for a moment before she turned away. The rest of the day passed in a haze, each interaction with him feeling like walking a tightrope. That evening, after Mom had gone to bed, William found me in the living room. We need to talk, he said, his voice low. I shook my head. Not now, Emily, I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. His expression hardened, but he stepped back, giving me space. The days that followed were a blur of tension and avoidance, every glance, every word felt loaded. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mom knew more than she was letting on. And then she confronted me one evening. I need to talk to you, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. We sat at the kitchen table, the air thick with unspoken words. What's going on between you and William? She asked, her eyes piercing. Nothing, I said too quickly, my voice betraying me. She didn't look convinced. Emily, I know something's not right. Just tell me the truth. I couldn't answer, the words caught in my throat, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Her expression softened, but her voice remained firm. William isn't who you think he is. There's a lot you don't know about him. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice cracking. She shook her head. We'll talk tomorrow. Right now, I need you to think long and hard about what you're doing. And just like that, she left, leaving me alone with my thoughts, alone with the weight of everything that had happened.